Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Hello and welcome. We're going to get started. So Lily Cheng, distinguished engineer and director of Fuse, and our unofficial chief social officer, is going to be introducing Londa Schiebinger. And before we get started, I just wanted to mention that this work that Londa's going to be presenting is really applicable to all of the stuff that we do as well. So as she's talking, you should be thinking about how it applies to your own work. And she's very excited to hear the connections that you make as you listen. So if you have time afterwards, before running off for Memorial Day weekend, please stick around and come up and share it with her so that she can hear ways that you see this applying to yourself. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. All right, so for those of you who don't know, in Fuse, we focus a lot on social interaction and design, and I think one of the main things that you do in a design group is you go talk to the people that you're designing for as a first step. And I think a lot of Lana's work really embodies that and helps us think more of systems in different ways that we could even expand that practice of talking to diverse people as you begin to design your projects, especially women. So for a little background, Lana is at Stanford, and she is directing the Gendered Innovation in Science, Medicine, Engineering, and Environment project. And I think you have over 60 different collaborators. It's a really amazing project, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that. She's really one of the foremost international experts on gender in science and technology, and I think a topic that is really a focus of ours, so very excited for this. And there's a couple different ways that I think we can think about women in our workforce. One is just how do we get more women to participate in science and technology, and what is really the role of gender in culture and science, and then also for the projects and work that we do, how can we make sure we really are designing for women as an audience. And I think when you look at a lot of our Microsoft products, they sometimes reflect a less diverse audience than we think. And I think this becomes especially true as we start thinking of less platform-oriented projects, but maybe things that you wear and devices, and social software obviously deals with community and things like that. So Londa has an amazing, a set of things she's done. She's addressed the United Nations on this topic. She's won numerous prizes and awards. There's including the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Alexander von Humboldt Research Prize. So very cool stuff. And obviously also has written a lot of books on this topic. So thank you so much for coming, and definitely look forward to hearing the talk. And again, if people want to kind of have smaller group participation at the end and really brainstorm and share some of the projects that you're doing and ways that we might do better with diversity, I think having some small group conversations after the talk would really be great, so just stick around. Thank you and welcome.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I've had a good time so far. Went out to dinner with some of your wonderful people. I know a lot about universities, and I know a lot about funding agencies, and that I don't know much about industry. And when I go somewhere, I always like to take something home with me. So please do stick around. I'd like to see if what I say has any resonance with you and how it might apply to your work. So please do let me know. So today I'd like to explore with you gendered innovations. The operative question here is, how do we harness the creative power of gender analysis to discover new things? I'm about research and integrating gender analysis into research design. So your series here is about enhancing gender and ethnic diversity. It's remarkably important to have diversity in teams, but is the crucial thing to have diverse bodies in the room, or is it that everybody should learn how to design for diverse audiences? So that's one thing that we can think about. So first, a little bit of background. Governments and universities have taken 3 strategic approaches to gender equality over the past several decades. The first is fix the numbers of women. This means focusing on increasing women's numbers participating in science and engineering. And in your series, Marie Claway took this approach. How do you increase the number of women in computer science? The second is fixing the institutions. This promotes gender equality in careers through structuring change in research organization. And Jane Margulis discussed changes in these areas. And the third is fix the knowledge, or gendered innovations. This stimulates excellence in science and technology by integrating sex and gender analysis into research. Today, we focus on this third strategic approach. It's the newest and hottest area, so maybe you haven't heard about it so much yet, and I think the most important for the future of science, engineering, and innovation. And this is what gendered innovations is all about. A lot of this is most developed in the biomedical field, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit and then segue over to things which are important to your core business. So we know that doing research wrong can cost lives and money. This is especially evident in medicine, but I think for industry as well. If you have a product that fails once you've launched it, then that's going to cost you money. So for example, 10 drugs were withdrawn from the US market between 1997 and 2000, and 8 of these drugs posed greater risk for women. Not only do these drugs cost billions of dollars, Forbes magazine puts the price tag at $5 billion for a new drug because they factor in all the failed drug candidates. But when a drug fails, it can cause death and human suffering. So we can't afford to get it wrong. Doing research right saves lives and money. In the 1990s, we had the large governmental research project, the Women's Health Initiative, you've probably heard of, and one of the basic studies that they did was hormone therapy. Should women after menopause replace their hormones? Should they take a lot of hormone therapy? And we've just done an analysis. So the answer is no, you shouldn't. It causes breast cancer and other things. So there's just been an analysis of this study. And for every dollar spent in the study, $140 were returned in diseases that didn't happen. So there's no healthcare cost for that. And we saved lots of lives. There were 76,000 fewer cases of cardiovascular disease, 126,000 fewer breast cancers, 145 more quality-adjusted years. While most of the results are positive, there was the downside of more osteoporotic fractures. When you lose your estrogen, your bones become more fragile. But we can use lifestyle changes for that. Exercise, the right kind of diet can, in fact, help you keep your bone. It's crucially important to get the research right, and this is the goal of the Gendered Innovations Project. This project develops state-of-the-art methods of sex and gender analysis, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. And we also provide 25 examples or case studies to illustrate, real live examples of how adding the sex analysis or the gender component to what you're doing gets you something better. So today I want to introduce the methodological resources that are on this peer-reviewed website. Gendered Innovations developed over the past 5 or 6 years through interactive, interdisciplinary workshops. We had workshops of about 15 people all across Europe, the US, and now we're into South Korea. And these were really fabulous for every technical field that we took. And I'll be talking about some of these. We had the experts from that field, plus the gender experts. And, there were conversations that had never happened before. It was very exciting for me personally. And then we met in beautiful places like Berlin and Paris. And, it was really fun. So again, the question is, how can we harness the creative power of sex and gender analysis for discovery? I'd like to present to you some of the outcomes. I'm first going to take an example from medicine, and then I'll come closer to your core business. And these are some of the aha moments we had from our workshops. So my first example comes from cells and tissues, and I want to look specifically at stem cell therapy. let's go back to a moment to why those 10 drugs were withdrawn from the market. As I said, it costs a lot of money these days to develop a drug. So there are many reasons why drugs fail, and fail more often for women. But one reason is that research is still most often done in males, whether it's humans, animals, or cells and tissues. We have some good data on this. This study was done in 2011 by some of our colleagues at Berkeley, and it shows the sex of the animal used in the research in these particular areas. They took the run of the journal for a year, and they found that mostly male animals were used in all of these fields for basic research. The two fields that have more females are reproduction and immunology. But what I'm interested in is this area here. I guess it turned out purple. This is where the sex of the cell, the sex of the animal is not reported. And this is data wasted to research. You might as well throw the money out the window because you can't do any meta-analysis. It's just something people have failed to get some of the basic data that you know. This study was done also for cells and tissues, done at Mayo Clinic, also in 2011. And here you see only gray area. The sex of the cells is almost never reported. And again, this is research money wasted. Now let's look at stem cells. And now I want to take you to our website. And you're welcome to use the website in any way you want. It's all public information and free. We have our methods in buckets here. The methods are, if you haven't had this kind of information in your curriculum, if you weren't taught how to do sex or gender analysis, these provide questions that you can put to your materials. Then we have our case studies in buckets here: science, health and medicine, engineering, and which is where computer science would be, and environment. So first I'm going to go to stem cells and tell you a little bit about this case study. Okay, good. Why might the sex of the cell be relevant? Research shows that there are sex differences in the therapeutic capacity of stem cells. This slide shows very simply stem cells taken from muscle tissue and shows that the female cells are more active than the male cells. So you can see this kind of different regenerative capacity. Yet very few researchers consider the sex of the cell. We have a world-class stem cell researcher at Stanford who works on Parkinson's disease. And she was doing some research using all female stem cells. This is an arbitrary decision on her part. I talked to her. It's quite unconscious. She just thought, okay, I'll use those. But it means that in the discovery phase, she won't see anything unique to the male stem cell, so opportunity missed, nor will she and her team detect any important differences in the function between male and female cells. So again, opportunity missed. Not considering the sex of the cell can lead to failed research. An international research team in Norway and Australia were working with stem cells in mice. And they very correctly used both sexes in the mice. They had male mice and female mice. But again, they used all female stem cells, again, unconscious, arbitrary decision, and the result was that their male mice died, and they didn't know why. And they thought, well, they put it on the shelf, they didn't know how to go on, they thought, oh, postdoc probably made a mistake. You know, when in doubt, you blame your postdoc. So eventually, through a gendered innovation project in Norway, the team realized that they should consider also the sex of the stem cell, not only of the animal, but the sex of the stem cell. And they found that for their project, male to male worked well, and female stem cell to female animal. But you have to consider all of the possible combinations before you rule them out. And you'll be interested to know that the same is true for organ transplant. Hope you never do need a heart. But if you do, you better find out what the studies say about which sex combination works well. And then for heart transplants, it becomes a little bit complicated because we know that it is sex matching that is the thing that works best, but women donate more organs. So your surgeon may not be able to choose the ideal organ for you. So we have a sex issue here, and we have a gender issue that interact in that particular example. Now, even for the stem cells, the method I was talking about here is analyzing sex. You see that the fourth down. But you have to consider also factors intersecting with sex and gender. When you're doing this, if you look around the room here, all women aren't the same in the room and all men aren't the same. So we have to consider differences within those groups. If we're doing that. So for humans, there are all kinds of differences that are important. And even in these stem cells, we have to look at the environment that they're in. We have to look at the hormonal environment, immunological issues, and you have to look at the type of the stem cell and the disease being treated. So you can't just analyze sex or just analyze gender. You have to look at these intersecting issues. And that's what our methods try to get at. Okay, now I'm going to come to my second example, and I'm going to come closer to home for you. And I'm going to look at an example from computer science and specifically machine translation. So natural language processing. And let me start with a little story. A couple of years ago, I was in Spain, and there were a lot of newspaper articles about me. I don't read Spanish, so when I got home, I zoomed it through Google Translate. And I was shocked that there is a masculine default in both Google Translate and Sistran, which is the big European system. So Londa Schiebinger, he wrote occasionally, it considered. So how can such a cool company as Google make such a fundamental error? My agency was wiped out. I mean, I've worked very hard to get where I'm going, and, I just thought, this is ridiculous. So Google Translate defaults to the masculine pronoun because he said, so here comes our gender analysis, because he said is more commonly found on the web than she said. And here's the interesting part. We know from Ngram, also a Google product, down where I live, you can't live without Google. But you can pretend I didn't say that. So we know from Ngram that he said the ratio of he said to she said peaked in 1968 at 4-to-1, and then it declined by 2000 to 2-to-1. So what else happened in this period? Right, we had big social change. There's the women's movement. The NSF starts increasing budget to increase the number of women in engineering, right? We have all kinds of changes. Presidents are using inclusive language. Television commentators are using inclusive language. Everybody is using inclusive language. So, but the machine is defaulting to the masculine pronoun when it's doing translation. So with one algorithm, Google wiped out 40 years of very hard-fought cultural and social change. And they didn't mean to. So we invited Google to a workshop, one of these fun workshops we have, and we also invited a natural language processor from Stanford, and they listened for about 20 minutes, and they got it, and they said, oh, we can fix that. I mean, Google was appalled, right? They had no idea. It's unconscious bias again. They just hadn't checked for that. So fixing is great, but constantly retrofitting for women is not the best road forward. I had to ask myself, how is it that those Google engineers got out of Stanford, where a lot of them are educated, without knowing the basics of gender stuff? So we teach a lot of gender courses at Stanford. I teach a course on gendered innovations, a little bit like what I'm telling you right now. But it's an elective, and kids have to opt for it. And I think what we need to do, I want to work now with the new Dean of Engineering to fix the engineering curriculum, the computer science curriculum, and I was discussing at lunch how we might incorporate some of the basics about gender issues right into the core curriculum so that people will get out and won't make these silly mistakes. Now, why does machine translate default to the masculine pronoun? The machine gets a score of 68% if it chooses the male pronoun. So it gets a higher score than if it did not. And another issue is that the translation program can't understand context. So even though Londa is the 1,543rd most popular woman's name in the United States, the machine can't connect that fact, which it can very well know, to the rest of the content in the paragraph or the sentence. So this masculine default has then some unintended long-term consequences. If we keep adding translations to the web that just defaulted to he, you're going to be creating the future, right? And the machine will even more often choose he in any of its translations. So we're building a future, we're reinforcing gender inequality when we don't intend to. So I think that we are much smarter than that. Now, I don't have to pick on Google. There are other companies with unconscious gender bias. And it means that these unconscious assumptions, it means that we're not developing the very best product that we could for the greatest number of people. So Apple released its health app in September, and if you have an iPhone, which I do, it downloads it automatically for you. You can't miss Apple's health app. And the health app tracks everything. It tracks your steps, it tracks your blood alcohol content, it tracks your intake of sodium and magnesium and your heartbeat and blood pressure and everything. So what doesn't it track? The menstrual cycle. Now, there are, and when you see the release of the product, the videos of the release, it's like, oh, we track everything. So there are lots of reasons why women might want to track their menstrual cycles. So again, this product can be fixed. There are lots of apps that in fact do track the menstrual cycle, and it can be added. But couldn't we consider gender from the outset? What radically new things could we conceive? And now the Gendered Innovations Project is launching a series of tech roundtables. So I'm going to be inviting maybe people like you from Microsoft Research to come and join up. I'd like to understand how you think about gender in your products, in your design, and learn more about what's going on there. So we hope to be launching some of these in the fall. We have a partner in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. She's going to do them on the East Coast. I'm going to do them on the West Coast, and then we think we'll have if we get good stuff, we'll have a gender summit that kind of summarizes some of these things and excites people about it. Now, I'm going to go for a final example because I want to hear from you as well. And this is Assistive Technology, and I think I've put that for the elderly. And believe me, the robots are coming. World population will age dramatically by 2050, and you can see that it's a problem, especially for Europe, it's a problem for the US, it's a problem for Japan, and some of the Asian countries as well. Large elderly populations will place a growing strain on human caregivers and our health and social systems. So this case study explores markets of assistive technologies for the elderly and looks at the value added of considering both sex and gender when designing these technologies. So what we want are designs that will look at sex differences between men and women. So we want people to look at the sex-related physical needs that elderly people would require in these technologies. So women, for example, tend to live longer, but they usually have more debilitating disease. And men, for example, tend to lose their hearing earlier. Sometimes these are occupational issues. They've worked with loud construction objects or something like that. So we not only need to look at the physical needs of this population, but also at the gender-related social needs and how that should fit into the technology. We see that there are different gendered patterns between men and women. Men and women tend to have different partnering patterns. When they're elderly, women very much live more often alone than men do. And then men and women have different experience in household management. As you know, that because maybe the men haven't taken care of homes so much and they lose their partner, they have different receptivities to technology. And for instance, elderly women tend to live alone more often. So our engineering checklists here and our terms and our methods encourage researchers to analyze how sex and gender interact in individual men and women so that they can design the most effective and marketable assistive technologies. Designers want their products to be useful and appealing to both men and women. So gender issues become more important as the assistive technologies become more personalized. And this is, so I should have better pictures of the robots. This is the one that the European Union was using, the companionable robot. And we were talking, we had a workshop with roboticists, and they all claimed that they had no gender in their robots. But then the guys who developed this told me that they spontaneously started calling their robot Hector. Not only did they conceive it as male, but as a gladiator, right? So poor Hector here. So there are a lot of robots that are developing, and one is a robotic nurse named Cody that can bathe people. Now, bathing is a very intimate relationship between human and machine, and so designers will really want to make sure that both men and women of different social backgrounds are comfortable with these machines as we move forward. Another assistive robot is Herb, the home exploring robot butler who can fetch household items for you. Herb can fetch you a cup of tea. He can remind you to take your medicines or even clean up the kitchen. Now, if there's a robot that can clean up the kitchen, I'm ordering it right away. As these robots enter our lives, we humans will gender them. Do you see? I've changed the direction now. We gender things. Studies of machine voices, that is to say synthetic voices, machine-generated voices, show that human listeners tend to gender machine voices. That is to say, we interpret them as the voice of a man or a woman, even when the designer intended that voice to be neutral. This is the work of the late Cliff Nass, really interesting work. So Apple's Siri, the original iPhone voice, is interesting in this regard. As a party game, I used to ask Siri why she's a woman when she was only a woman. And one of her responses was, I was not assigned a gender, implying that it's not Apple's fault that you, the listener, ascribe gender to her. That's your problem. And as soon as we humans interpret a voice as masculine or feminine, we tend to apply all of our cultural stereotypes to that machine, right? So we have this, we really want to understand the world in terms of gender, and that's one of the things that we do. So here we need to come back again to this method that I talked about earlier, and that is analyzing factors intersecting with sex and gender. So when we're talking about designing assistive technology for the elderly and looking at men or women, we have to say which men or which women. We have to think about differences in ethnicity, differences in ages, differences in physical ability, that sort of thing, so that we can, in fact, do a better job for a larger group of people. So for example, Siri can't understand my friend's French accent at all, and my Jamaican friend can't get any kind of voice that would match his. So there are many factors that we need to consider. Considering sex and gender when designing new assistive technologies will be one important factor to ensure that products are successful with all users. And on our website, we now have about 25 examples. You can click into any of them and see them. And I encourage you to go look at them. We always have an abstract, so you can learn a lot in a little bit of time. We have then our full case study, which is not very long. And I also made a popular version for journalists because so many people were calling. And that's called In a Nutshell. You can read that as well. So designing sex and gender analysis into research and innovation is one crucial component contributing to world-class science and engineering. Now I want to end with just a little bit of attention to policy. Policy is one driver of innovation, and I know it's not so important for you in companies because you don't respond to those funding things, but it's important for you to know the pressure that is on your colleagues in other sectors. So we incorporated all of the policies that we know for granting agencies. Granting agencies can ask applicants to explain how sex and gender is relevant to their proposed research as a requirement for funding. And this is where it gets really interesting. In December 2013, the European Commission, which is the NSF, NIH, and NEH for Europe, developed its next funding framework for the next 6 or 7 years, and they identified 137 areas of science and technology where they will be looking for sex and gender in the proposal. So if you don't say how it works, you're not likely to get a high score for your funding. So these fields include computer hardware and architecture, nanotechnology, oceanography, geoscience, organic chemistry, aeronautics, space medicine, biodiversity, it goes on and on. It's not, they haven't included things like theoretical physics where we don't know how gender works in those projects. So it's really just areas where they have evidence already that this would be a value-added proposition. Then since 2010, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research have asked for sex and gender in their proposals, and they're currently giving teeth to this policy. So far, they've just asked that you include it, but now they're looking to make it 10% of the grade for any proposal. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, since 2008, has asked for gender as a requirement for funding in development work. The foundation, and what's so great about their program is that the program officers will help the researcher, if the researcher doesn't have background in this area, to understand how they should do the work. And now the National Institutes, the U.S. National Institutes of Health, this is what's coming, this is the big one, and there's a lot of activity and excitement about this. In fall 2014, the US NIH announced that it would be requiring sex analysis in preclinical research. So that's in cells, tissues, and animals. As you probably know, since 1993, we've had a federal law that women and underrepresented minorities must be included in clinical trials. And that has always been a problem because you're going to do the research on human women, but you haven't done it on mice and rats earlier. You haven't included the females there. So what kind of scientific research is that? It doesn't seem very safe. And then, so that's policy at the beginning of the research process to the granting agencies encourage researchers to include sex and gender analysis, and then also at the end of the research. And I'd be interested to know if any of your journals are beginning to ask for this, but journals are now requiring that sex and gender be included in the research, or it's not excellent research, and so the reviewers would have a problem with it. So I'm very interested to find out what industry can do. Products and systems that incorporate the smartest aspects of gender can open new markets. Products that meet the needs, the complex needs of diverse user groups enhance global competitiveness and sustainability. So I'll be watching to see what Microsoft does. You can be a leader, and I'll watch for the fireworks to the north. Thank you.